Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Perfect. We can make our way in. Welcome, everybody. My name is Lorenzo Vidino. I am the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. And I'm really delighted to be back at ICT this year, to be back at what pretty much everybody considers the most important conference in our field. So it's really a delight for me. And it's a delight that also this year, for the, I believe, fourth time, we're co-sponsoring an event with ICT. We're co-sponsoring two panels. The one we're in now, which is Jihadism in the West, and one that my colleague Seamus Hughes moderated this morning, which was about right-wing extremism in the West. This is sort of what we at the program, and I apologize for the short pitch about the program and what we do, this is what we try to do, which is cover all sorts of extremism, particularly in the United States and Europe, ranging from jihadist, Islamist, to right-wing, to left-wing, to a variety of different ideologies that can be seen as extremist, finding similarities and differences, and so on. Today, we speak about jihadism in particular. We speak about it at a time that is very different from the last time we did that at ICT, which was 2019. And I think 2019, we had started to see the decline of jihadist activities in the West, but it wasn't something as acquired, as established, as consolidated as it is now. I think we can now say we've been, at least when it comes to the West, in a phase of steady decline of jihadist activities. If we want to just look at it from an empirical point of view, if we look at the numbers of arrests that we have seen in Europe and the United States, compare the last 2 or 3 years with the, let's say, the glory days of the last wave of jihadism, the ISIS-related mobilization, so 2014, 15, 16, the number of arrests are halved. If anybody saw the presentation by my good friend Claudio Galzerano from Europol, or you read the numbers on the TSAT, the Europol publication, you see that the number of arrests in all European countries are basically half of what we were 4 or 5 years ago. The phenomenon of foreign fighters is not entirely disappeared, but almost. I think we are in the single digits when it comes to individuals that from Europe or the United States try to travel to different countries in Africa or the Middle East or Asia to join jihadist groups. And finally, attacks. While we still see occasional attacks in most Western countries, we've seen around 5 or 6 every year for the last 2 or 3 years. They are less and significantly less sophisticated and lethal than we were, again, in the 2014 to 2017 timeframe. So it's not gone. I think anybody that has studied the phenomenon for a long time understands that it's arguably part of a physiological phase of ups and downs, ebbs and flows in jihadism. If we see the jihadism in the West as a phenomenon that has been with us for 40 years, give or take, I would say from the early 80s, we see that there's always been a combination of two factors that determines the intensity and the direction of jihadism in the West. There's always a milieu, a bubble, groups, networks, isolated individuals in the West that adopt jihadist ideology, that sympathize with it, that always exist, that subculture, substratus. But it's external events that take place outside of the West that determine the size of that milieu, its direction, and its lethality. So if in the 80s was the Afghan conflict, this Soviet-Afghan conflict that led a few individuals from the West to travel and join the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, then in the 90s, early 90s was the war in Bosnia, then we had a bit in Chechnya in the late 90s, 9/11, Iraq with the invasion. By 2009, 2010, we start to see a phenomenon that is fairly similar to what we're witnessing today, a lull in activity. Sort of the idea was that it had plateaued, beginning of the Arab Spring, with the promise, elusive promise that it brought in the early days. And I think I remember being at IDC around that time, and there was sort of an agreement that jihadism had plateaued. Then, of course, we only needed to fast forward 1 or 2 years with what went on in Syria to see that things are quite different. Jihadist networks in Europe boomed in size. New people embraced the ideology, and we saw 5,000 to 6,000 individuals traveling to join ISIS and other groups. Since then, we're on the low end of these ups and downs. Of course, none of us has a crystal ball and know where things will go, if we will see again a rise in activities. Historically, one would think so. But if it will happen, how it will happen, when it will happen, I think it's close to impossible for anybody to predict. But I have 5 wonderful speakers, distinguished scholars here, that can help us understand what has happened over the last few years, both when it comes to the dynamics within jihadist networks and the responses that they have elicited from governments, and arguably discuss also what we might be seeing in the next few years. This was probably a longer than expected introduction, because I want to leave as much space as possible to our distinguished speakers. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we're gonna have them speak for around 15 minutes each. That should leave us enough time for a very good Q&A, in which I really solicit your participation in asking questions and engaging them in a debate. So, without further ado, let me introduce them, starting with our first speaker. But I'd like to read a short bio for everybody, and then I'll call you here. We'll start with Ido Levy, who is an IDC graduate, so home turf here. He received his BA from IDC here in Herzliya. He's at the Washington Institute, where he has produced a lot of very interesting research on different aspects of ISIS, but in particular on the military effort of the group. Has written a very good book called Soldiers of End Times, Assessing the Military Effectiveness of the Islamic State. And he will be speaking about jihadist attitudes when it comes to attacking the West. After that, we'll move to Liam Duffy. Liam is a strategic advisor for Counter-Extremism Project, which is a New York-based international policy organization. Liam has been writing extensively about different aspects of Western jihadism and Islamism, and I'd like to make a distinction between the two, about the Western recruits, and he writes often very interesting and very thought-provoking pieces, particularly in Unheard. Then we're gonna move to, I apologize for all the paper here. We're gonna move to Austin Doctor. Austin is the Director of Counter-Terrorism Research Initiatives at the National Counter-Terrorism Innovation, Technology and Education, NSITE Center, which is a good partner and friend of the Program on Extremism, which is a department of, more importantly, a Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence, and he's also an assistant professor of political science at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. His research focuses on militant actors and terrorism. He has done very, very good work on Africa. Has recently published a piece with our center on ISIS in Mozambique, which is a very timely topic. And he will speak about the reintegration of Western foreign fighters and their families. After that, we will move to Katja Theodorakis, who is the head of counterterrorism at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, in Canberra, which is arguably Australia's most important think tank. Katja has an extensive background in extremism and terrorism research with academic, policy-relevant, and international experience. She has been at some of the most prominent institutions in Australia, spent significant time in the Middle East, and she will speak about jihadism in Australia, which is an oftentimes overlooked topic, but is quite important considering how important Australia has been when it comes to the ISIS-related mobilization. Last, but definitely not least, is our good friend Aimen Dean. I don't think I need to read the bio, I can't find it, but I don't think I need to find the bio. Aimen is the managing director, if I'm not mistaken, at the 5 Dimension Consultants, which is a company based in Dubai that specializes in terrorism financing. Aimen, of course, as most of you know, a very interesting background, having been born in Saudi Arabia and then having in the late 90s pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda and having been a member of Al-Qaeda for several years, and having then eventually worked for MI6 in providing substantial information on his previous organization. This movie-like story is told in an autobiography that came out, I suppose the movie is forthcoming, or should be. We'll talk about it. In a book that he published, you gotta, again, I can't find your bio, you gotta remind me the title of the book. 9 Lives, which I strongly, strongly recommend. So without further ado, again, apologize for the very, very long introduction. I think if we can move with Ido first and you give the presentation. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm trying to get this thing to work. But, okay, well, why isn't this working? Yeah, it's not working.
You can talk about your time at IDC, what was great about
Well,
IDC.
yeah, I will say, first of all, thank you to Lorenzo, and thank you to ICT and the GW Project on Extremism for putting this together and for inviting me. It's just really amazing to be back here after graduating from here, so it's really kind of surreal in a way, and I'm really, really happy to be here with you. All right, great, yes, yeah, all right, there's the fun stuff. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk kind of like a broad overview of what are we talking about when why do jihadists even think about the West? What is it about the West that gets them going? We like to think, at least in the U.S., that jihadists have something really hard against us. I'm going to try to show that maybe it's not that way, but I just wanted to give you this broad overview going back in history to understand the ideology, understand their attitudes, and how that influences their behavior when it comes to attacking the West. So let's go. So I'm going to go back really to the 60s. That's where I kind of start this rise of modern jihad. In the 60s, we see humiliating defeats by Muslim-majority countries by Israel, which, of course, the Jewish state, which jihadists refer to as the Zionists, and say that this defeat by secularized states, was largely because these Muslim leaders have lost their way. We need to go back to Islam. And that's where we get this thinker on the bottom here, Sayyid Qutb, who spoke about separating ourselves from the West, going back to the traditions. But he also came with an extremist view of overthrowing this corrupt, secularized, westernized government in order to bring about a just Islamic regime. And he talked about that's the near enemy, those corrupt regimes that like Egypt, where he came from, that they sought to overthrow and replace them with religious regimes. But this turned out to be very difficult. Israel turns out to be very strong, thank God. And a lot of these secular regimes wouldn't budge so easily. That's why this other guy that I have up here, Abdullah Azzam, came up with the ideology that we have to move. He was actually a Palestinian scholar, and he said our jihad in these westernized societies, in the Zionist society, is not really working. We have to go and do it where it will work, and that's where the idea of immigrating to fight in a foreign territory began, and that's where we have the Afghan jihad against the Soviets, of foreign fighters traveling to fight there. He was really the ideological, he started the ideological backbone behind this, and a lot of the logistical components that required this. Out of this background came the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and they were really the first major kind of implementers of this ideology, but we'll see that it didn't play out exactly as Qutb and others thought it would. So Al-Qaeda was really the first jihadist group that said, actually, we really do have to focus on the West. The West has to be our primary target. These secularized Arab regimes, these corrupt regimes are actually being backed by the West, and that's the reason they're so strong, is because they have this Western backing. If we're able to defeat those regimes, then we'll be able to take over very easily. And that's where this comes from. Any study on Al-Qaeda would have to refer to this, Osama bin Laden's declaration of war against the West in 1996, where he says, after Iman, there is no more important duty than pushing the American enemy out of the Holy Land. So in this case, it's about America. America is the heart of the West. They're giving all the big support. We have to hit them hard in order to get them out. And once they're out, we'll be able to take over. That was the idea. And this is very important here because he says after Iman. Iman is the #1 most important thing in Islam faith, belief in one God. And he's saying that if you believe in one God, then you have to be doing this. So this is something that was very he was trying to resonate with Muslims from this. Now, Osama bin Laden's theory was that the US can't stomach terrorism. So our strategy against the West is going to be terrorism. Look what happened in the Beirut barracks bombing. Well, not all of these weren't really, that wasn't perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, by Hezbollah, against an American Marine base in Beirut. Look what happened after that bombing. The US took off and they left and they never came back to Lebanon. Look what happened after the Aden hotel bombings. It caused the US to rethink getting involved in Yemen and other places. The Black Hawk Down incident, when the US lost a few soldiers in Somalia and they decided to withdraw. So if we keep doing this kind of terrorist strategy, eventually they'll leave. What bin Laden really advocated was terrorism with small secretive units, not holding permanent bases, because permanent bases of territory, holding territory can make you into a target, and the more powerful Western-backed forces will be able to defeat you. But that's actually not what happened at all. Well, we saw that there was the motivation behind 9/11. Bin Laden said, we'll hit them really hard, 9/11 happens, and then we actually get more involved in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and so this kind of completely backfired. And a lot of Al-Qaeda's franchises that came out of this, Al-Qaeda had major franchises in Iraq, Yemen, the Maghreb, and in Somalia. And these guys down here under Osama bin Laden, they all were leaders of different Al-Qaeda affiliates at different times. And they said, actually, we do want to take permanent bases. The whole point of jihad is to take over a country and create an Islamic state. That's our whole purpose for being here. Hiding in a cave and waiting until the right time to strike, it's not a very popular thing, it turns out. And so what we see is that from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the guy on the right here, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, he had a policy of, after the US invasion, he tried to take over cities in Iraq. We know about the battles, for example, of Fallujah, the battle for Ramadi, battle of Baku, but we can go into more and more examples of jihadists trying to take over cities and hold them, even against military forces that were much more superior to them. We have examples of this in Somalia up until today, in Yemen, and in many places. So, and this was all against Osama bin Laden and Aimen al-Zawahiri, his right-hand man, who became the leader of Al-Qaeda afterwards and was recently killed. Their advice, which said, don't do this, we have to wait until the time is right. None of them really listened. And that's where we get ISIS, because ISIS said, this whole Al-Qaeda ideology is completely wrong. We shouldn't be waiting. We shouldn't be doing any of that. And they accused Al-Qaeda of committing irja, which is an important concept in Islam that means delaying something that you should be doing, basically. And they're saying, you're delaying the return of the caliphate. We have the power to do it now. We should be fighting the infidels, and we should be fighting them right now to create our caliphate. And by not doing that, they're committing apostasy, and that's how the conflict between Al-Qaeda and ISIS begins. And for those who don't know, ISIS and Al-Qaeda fight each other violently. They have a very strong conflict that continues today. And they also accused Al-Qaeda of being stuck in the phase of Nikaya attacks, which basically means terrorist attacks of things like 9/11 or attacks just like hit-and-run attacks. And they're saying this is not the way to do it. We have to be true warriors. You know, this picture of Islamic State fighters, they're like, this is what we should be doing. We should be going out there and fighting. We should be fighting like true warriors, not like hiding in caves and waiting for the right time to strike. So that's how that happened. And so what am I really trying to say with all this is that Al-Qaeda's fixation on attacking the West is kind of an outlier in jihadist history. It was really Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri who they came with this ideology. Most of their followers didn't really agree with it. They all wanted to attack the near enemy. They didn't really, attacking the West for them was kind of a distant target. It's something that is important in some sense of getting the West out of our business, but in the end of the day, what they wanted to do is take over these countries and implement Islamic states. So here I have this little periodization here. If you look at this, the only time when the primary, you could say the real primary method of jihadists was terrorism was during this period right before 9/11, when Al-Qaeda was very focused on hitting the West, hitting the United States as hard as possible. And where does this come from, this idea? Is that because Al-Qaeda had this big strategic focus on the West, it was all about getting the West out of our business. But when ISIS came, they said, we should be our primary target should be the near enemy, those corrupt regimes. We should be taking them over and turning them into Islamic states. The West kind of became a secondary objective because the West was still involved in supporting other armies that were fighting against the jihadists. So when ISIS had the capability to do it, for example, in 2015-16, they did organize terrorist attacks in the West because they were trying to persuade the West by force to get out of ISIS's war, because they understood that it was going to be a big problem for them. Now, when I talk about this 2001 to the present, the Islamic State period, I'm not only talking about ISIS. Of course, ISIS that's the Islamic State, but I'm talking about the goal of jihadists at this time was to create an Islamic State on the ground. After the invasion of Afghanistan, the fall of the Taliban regime, the Taliban's goal was to come back into power and reestablish an Islamic State. All of Al-Qaeda's affiliates tried to establish Islamic states in whichever country they were in. And so this period of focusing on terrorizing the West was quite short. Now I'm going to do a quick plug for my book here, because that's what my book is about, actually. You should really check it out if you haven't seen it yet. It's free online, and I can offer some free copies. But it's really about how did ISIS do this. They really decided to become a conventional army, and this was a big effort for them. And because of this ideology that they had to take over territory, they really invested a lot in becoming a conventional army that was difficult to defeat. So now just some implications to leave you with. The West is still a target for jihadists, but it's not really a priority, as we've seen, and it hasn't been a priority for a while. The priority of jihadists has been to create, again, Islamic states where they're operating. And fixation on the West is unpopular with jihadists. Look what happened when ISIS came up and said, actually, we shouldn't be focusing on the West. We should be fighting on where we are, on the battlefield. It captured the imagination of jihadists around the world. We saw a huge foreign fighter influx. We saw a lot of popularity to this idea. And at the expense of Al-Qaeda, a lot of Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, many of their members defected to ISIS or became sympathetic to ISIS. This is very important for Al-Qaeda now because, as I write here, Al-Qaeda core is the only jihad. When I say Al-Qaeda core, I'm talking about the core leadership, not just the affiliates that are scattered around the world, but they're really the only group that's still advocating this primary focus on the West. And ISIS presents a much more exciting alternative. You don't have to hide and wait. You can actually go and fight right now. So this is going to be, I think this is going to be a problem for Al-Qaeda going forward as they have to compete for the battle over the narrative of who's in charge of the jihadist ideology. And the last thing is expect jihadist conventionalization, not the return to the short-lived period of terrorizing the West. What I mean by conventionalization is what we saw with ISIS, that it tried to actually become a conventional army and hold territory like a conventional army would. We've seen other Al-Qaeda affiliates do this as well, and ISIS provinces or ISIS affiliates around the world also tried to do this recently in Mozambique, recently in other countries around the world, in Somalia and the Philippines. So what we should be expecting is jihadists to do that, to actually go for that kind of conventional style of warfare. We shouldn't really be, we should be on the lookout for terrorism, of course, but to recognize also that terrorists will do these attacks on the West when they are strong enough to do so, like ISIS was, for example. And Al-Qaeda also was only able to plan such big attacks when it had a safe haven in Afghanistan. And by the way, it has a safe haven in Afghanistan today again. And that could be a new chapter of this story. So that's pretty much all I've got. And if you're interested in talking to me, there's my contact information.
Thank you. Excellent.
Do I just click through this? Let's get to the next. It's in process. Okay. Well, while we wait for that, thank you so much for having me. Gather, as long as the genuine national hero on the left over there for my country ended up being one of the only Brits who could make it here for obvious reasons. So unfortunately, that also means I'm far less important than all the other Brits who couldn't make it. So apologies, you're stuck with me, unlike Aimen, who is very important. And thank you, Lorenzo and ICT for the invitation. I think Lorenzo touched on this. I do a lot of writing. So I haven't really got a project or a data to introduce or explain or give you an overview of, but I'm going to make an argument or a series of arguments. So apologies in advance if it's a little bit scatterbrained and there's several threads that I try and pick apart. In order to do that, I'm going to start with a story. So the story is of a young Belgian who was arrested in Iraq in about 2004, 2005. He spent the best part of 10 years in detention in Iraq, and he, among those places where he was detained was Abu Ghraib, which is famous for obvious reasons, Camp Bukka as well, where kind of the deposed lieutenants of Saddam's regime mingled with religious fanatics of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, sowing the seeds we now know of ISIS. Intelligence reports from the time, this chap was named Usama Atta from Brussels. Intelligence assessments at the time deemed that he was a disorientated young kid who was in way over his head, even though he was known to be making jailbreak attempts with leadership of AQI and known associates of Zarqawi, who's the leader of AQI. After a big public and governmental campaign in Belgium, he was eventually repatriated. And within 1 year of his repatriation, he was granted a passport that he was never supposed to be able to get his hands on. And a few months after that, he turned up again in Iraq, where he was welcomed as an old friend by his former cellmates from Camp Bukka and Abu Ghraib, who were just about to basically set the region on fire as ISIS. He was given a senior post in ISIS. He was made director of external operations. From that position, he basically dispatched his childhood friends from Brussels and his own relatives back into Europe, disguised among refugees as Islamic State commandos, and they basically gunned down Friday night revelers in Paris and blew themselves up in Brussels airport. To move on from that one, around the same time, we've got a young Parisian named Sherif Kouachi, who was arrested in 2005, spent some time in a prison jail where he associated with senior Al-Qaeda operatives and a network that was funneling fighters and cash to Iraq to fight in the insurgency. His probation worker, and I don't mean this to shame this guy in any way, but his probation worker at the time appeared in a documentary saying, he was tricked into this, he didn't really understand what he was getting himself into. 10 years later, Sharif and his brother Saeed burst into the offices of Charlie Hebdo and gunned down everybody inside. Sorry, I'm going to continue. A little bit more recently, a chap called Usman Khan in the UK was arrested for a serious plot, convicted for a serious plot to blow up the London Stock Exchange. Upon his release, just a few years after involvement in that serious plot, he was part of a post-release program where he was even used in promotional material in that post-release program. Unfortunately, he turned a knife against volunteers on the program, and that was the Fishmongers Hall attack. So he killed people who were only trying to help him. So these, in a way, are stories that are kind of, in many different ways, emblematic of Lorenzo mentioned, our 3 to 4 decade fight against jihadism in the West. They're multi-generational. They show the long horizons we're dealing with here. We're dealing with 10, 12, 15 years between bouts of activity. But they also, I could give dozens more examples like this from this 3 to 4 decade period. They also speak to a kind of denialism that has blighted our response to jihadist terror, and particularly a minimization of jihadist agency. So a minimization of the reasons that people get involved in jihadist terror, which really, really hampers and blights our counterterrorism and our prevention of radicalization efforts. So to use a bit of alliteration, my title is Myths, Monsters and Manipulation, because I think that what we do in our public discourse on jihadist terrorists is kind of divide them into 2 camps. On the one hand, you've got those who are manipulated into doing this, and then on the other hand, you've got people whose crimes are obviously so monstrous that they're monsters, and we don't really need to ask any more questions about how they became involved in this movement, because they're just monsters, they're psychopaths, they're driven by bloodlust. And our discourse on counterterrorism really is failing because of that dichotomy. And I think emblematic of it is the 2 people on screen here, one being Shamima Begum from the UK and the other being Mohammed Emwazi, better known to the tabloids as Jihadi John. On the one hand, we've got Shamima Begum, who in the public imagination was groomed, trafficked now into ISIS, and I do take into account her young age. And then on the other hand, we've got Jihadi John, who was a monster. These 2 people are 2 among 900 Brits that left to join ISIS. They don't really tell us a whole lot about the movement and the type of people who joined ISIS, yet they dominate the conversation, they dominate the public discourse. For me, they're kind of a red herring, and that we need to look a little bit broader than that. You'll notice whether it's the manipulated or the monster, in neither cases do these individuals have intellectual agency, moral agency for what they're doing. And I know I'm probably preaching to the converted. You're probably sitting here thinking, I don't think there's many people in this room who would deny the agency of jihadist terrorists. I'm sure there aren't. But the kind of residue of that discourse is all over our counterterrorism efforts and our prevention efforts. So it's in the mouths of politicians. It's in funding streams that overwhelmingly want to see a response to online radicalization, even though this is primarily not an online phenomenon. It's in the media. It's in training sessions, it's in policies, policy documents, vulnerability to radicalization, this kind of language that is in all kind of CVE and those kind of efforts in Prevent in the United Kingdom. I also think it speaks to it's symptomatic of a broader problem where and for obvious reasons, we're here at a World Summit on Counterterrorism, we're all counterterrorism practitioners in our own way, so it's right that we focus on individuals and attacks, but I think we only focus on individuals and attacks to the exclusion of almost everything else. And I think that leaves us in danger of missing the woods for the trees. So we focus on these individual perpetrators. We look for the thing that happened in their past, the trauma that must have pushed them or driven them towards terrorism, instead of asking about the moral and intellectual drive behind their actions. And we look at attacks. You'll notice the only time we debate our response to jihadist terror is in the immediate aftermath of an attack. And as Lorenzo mentioned with the ebbs and flows, there are long, long periods where attacks are not happening, but that doesn't mean jihadists just stopped existing or suddenly become incels or the far right, because that's what we care about all of a sudden. So if it's not about individuals, what is it about? I think what we need to do is and I mentioned we look at individuals and attacks for obvious reasons and good reasons, being that it's counterterrorism, and we don't want to implicate people under counterterrorism lens who are not terroristic. But to really understand and grasp the movement, we need to put it back into its geographical, historical, and ideological context. So starting with the geographical, if it was kind of a movement of angry, disaffected, disillusioned, marginalized people, or people, Manchurian candidates radicalized online, we would see massive geographical distribution, but we don't see that. We see the complete opposite. If we look at these maps of foreign fighters from the UK, France, and Belgium, we see massive geographical concentrations of where foreign fighters left from. They're around certain population centers, and even if you zoomed out a little bit, we talk about Western jihadism and Western foreign fighters. Actually, 90% of Western foreign fighters with ISIS came from 5 or 6 countries. So it overwhelmingly doesn't affect most of Europe. It overwhelmingly doesn't affect most towns and cities. It only affects half a dozen to a dozen in each of these countries. And the flip side of it is really, really interesting. If you look at the areas that aren't affected, so in my own country, places like Glasgow, Bradford, were not overwhelmingly affected by the foreign fighter departures. Yet, if we accept the dominant discourses on radicalization, you would expect to see those areas affected. They have all the socioeconomic challenges you would expect. They have internet access, obviously. So those kind of CVE and kind of liberal socio-economic arguments for radicalization are challenged by that. But also they have large Muslim populations, which challenges the kind of framing of the right and the far right, which is that this is a problem only of Islam and Muslims. All of these dominant discourses on radicalization fall down when you look at this geographical clustering. To quote Jutta Clausen, who I had the pleasure of interviewing, little plug, it's on YouTube if you want to check it out. Recently, she put it as the growth of terrorist jihadist extremism is best explained by a simple axiom. To become a terrorist, you have to know one. So this is about real-world relationships. Various panelists throughout today and other days have used the term networks. It's definitely about that. It's about real-world relationships still. Even though the online is important, I would argue the distinction between online and offline existence is pretty artificial and one we've kind of made up. But it's not just about that. The key variable in those neighborhoods that were affected is the presence of jihadist veterans from previous conflicts. So some of the conflicts that Ido mentioned, Algeria, Afghanistan, Bosnia, these places where people came back, started associations, started NGOs, and started recruiting in their local neighborhood. Excuse me, and just to give a shout out to Aaron, who's in the fourth row there, he's done a phenomenal piece of work, which is in CTC Sentinel, on the role of Libyan jihadi veterans in the creation of the environment which eventually spawned the Manchester Arena bomber and other terrorists from that area as well. So the key variable is the presence of those veterans, but not just that, talking about putting it in its historical and ideological context, you also have to look at the neighborhoods and the way that those neighborhoods were kind of ideologically prepared, if you will, over generations, decades and decades and decades. So first you've got kind of a desecularization that takes place under Tablighi Jamaat, the missionary movement. Then you've got the emergence of Islamist groups, which Lorenzo can speak a hell of a lot better than I can. So the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Jamaat-e-Islami. Then you've got the emergence of a kind of political activist Salafism on top of that. And you have this mingling of all of these ideas, and it helps to prepare the ideological terrain in those neighborhoods. Add in, you've got the Salafi jihadist networks operating in those neighborhoods. So as a former member of the Muslim Brotherhood in the UK quoted to me, they basically at one point implicitly tolerated the Salafi jihadists they knew were in their midst because they just viewed them as kind of hot-headed and impatient. So in the interest of fairness, I should say that the British state also tolerated those Salafi jihadists for a long time. So this is where I'm going to say something that might sound a little bit counterintuitive. So I mentioned that we need to think a little bit bigger, put it back into its context. And I'm really glad about what Ido said about terrorism being an outlier during the OBL kind of years, is that the reason I say we need to think a bit bigger than counter-terrorism, and we need to think a bit bigger, certainly the kind of tropes and cliches that govern CVE, countering violent extremism, is I would say that jihadism is not primarily a terrorist movement. It's a way of life movement. It's a way of living movement. And I'll tell you what I mean by that through an example. So you might remember a few years ago, there were Muslim patrols in East London that captured the attention of the tabloids and the far right in London. I think because of that kind of ludicrous response from a group like Britain First, who launched their own Christian patrols in response, and the tabloids' panic that was set off by it, we kind of didn't really pay attention to that. But what this guy, Siddhartha Dar, who was famously another tabloid favourite, who was a Bounty Castle salesman in East London, told a Vice News documentary crew was, we don't recognise British law at all. We believe in Islam, we believe in Sharia, and that's what sets our parameters for right and wrong. Just a few months after giving this interview to Vice News, he turned up in IS territory with an AK-47 and a baby. So what this tells us is that most Salafi jihadists are not sitting there plotting to behead and bomb infidels in their off time. They're actually living the fantasy on a day-to-day basis. In that kind of 10 years of quiet that we saw between the 2004 bombings in Madrid and 2005 in London and then ISIS, they didn't go to sleep, they didn't stop operating, they lived their fantasy, they lived their dream every single day of their lives. They lived their lives according to Sharia, their interpretation of Sharia, as close as they could from inside the infidel West. So what ISIS did was, through the barrel of an AK-47, was transform that fantasy into a reality. So they suddenly just kind of dropped their proselytizing efforts in the UK, in Belgium, in France, in Denmark, in Sweden, and migrated to the caliphate instead. And departing overseas to fight to establish Sharia or go to Islamic State is by far and away the preferred choice of action for adherents to a Salafi jihadist worldview, not launching attacks, because it gives them the chance to live out that fantasy that they try to live out. So again, I don't want to turn the tools of counterterrorism and censorship against people who are not terrorists, but in order to understand how the movement might take shape in the future, we need to understand that it does not go away just because they're attacking. There are people who are Salafi jihadist adherents or adherents to that worldview who just live their lives like this according to this fantasy. So, who knows who will be the next group that will come along and turn that fantasy into a reality. The flip side of that is that unlike previous generations of veterans and returnees, this generation was overwhelmingly European-born, so wasn't necessarily always looking overseas. So we need to ask questions about how that's going to influence the future as well. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. Obviously mentioned that the foreign fighter flows to ISIS were far from the beginning. We're going to have the returnees and the influence of those returnees for several generations. I have no idea what time I'm on, so I'm just going to go through quicker because I think I've spoken for enough. We're all right? Okay. Don't have to rush, but give me another half hour. So I think just to wrap up my point, I think jihadism is a unique phenomenon and should be treated as such. I question the utility of coming up with like models of radicalization which can be applied to the far right or an incel or a jihadist. I think we need to treat this on its own intellectual terms as a distinct movement. I question the idea of having ideologically neutral or agnostic policies. I think we need to really think about this a bit more seriously. We need to take in the wider historical, geographical, and ideological context into which jihadism falls, which I've given a little bit of background on just there. And also the term network. So I would have for a long time said, this isn't about online radicalization. This isn't about, dispersed angry citizens rising up. This is about networks. But actually on reflection, given what I've just said, I don't think that's quite right. I think subcultures or micro-communities is a better way of thinking about it, because networks is kind of counter-terrorism language. It harks back to the days of Al-Qaeda, where we're talking about subterranean terrorist networks that are plotting, attacks against airliners and bombs in shoes and printer cartridges and things like that. That's fundamentally not how most Salafi jihadists behave, even in the West. So I think thinking about it as subcultures or micro-communities is a much better way of thinking about it. The challenge then, on that basis, is that for the next 10, 20 years, is it a terrorist threat or is it a social, intellectual threat that we're going to face? And I think we're pretty good at the counterterrorism now. We're pretty good at the policing, the military, the intelligence. I don't think we're prepared intellectually or socially for that kind of challenge at all. And as I said there, treat jihadism as a coherent intellectual challenge, not a movement of vulnerable individuals who are kind of pushed into terrorism. And if I'll just leave it at this, I think this was mentioned by both Lorenzo and Ido, but 9/11 ended up being, like you said, a bit of a miscalculation, I think. I think it invited confrontation with the West, which ended up decimating Al-Qaeda's leadership, but it also let the genie out of the bottle. It showed adherents around the world that you could strike at the heart of the United States and the West, and it advertised jihadist ideology to the world. Islamic State declared a caliphate, again invited confrontation with the West, which eventually reduced it to rubble. But what we need to ask now is who was watching, given that was advertised to the world on live television as well. That utopian endgame has now been advertised to the world in the way that 9/11 advertised the jihadist strategy to the world. So no longer attacks, now the way of life, the society, the revolutionary utopian society has been advertised. We don't really know who was watching, how many were watching, and it might be a decade or two until we really feel the impact of that. So I would urge, just because we're not having the same level of attacks, I think we still need to be thinking quite seriously about how this movement evolves. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone, and let me be the first to wish you a good afternoon. It's a privilege to participate today. Lorenzo, to the Program on Extremism, to ICT, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here to learn from my fellow panelists. This was brilliant. I look forward to learning from the other presentations as well. My name is Austin Doctor. I'm the Director of Counterterrorism Research Initiatives at Insight. That's the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, the United States DHS Center of Excellence for Terrorism and Counterterrorism Studies. By training, I'm a political scientist, so that's the lens, that's the background that I bring to bear on this problem, this common problem set that we share. I specialize in militant actors, terrorism, and emerging threats. But I think more importantly, for purposes today, is that like everyone in this room, I'm really here because I'm also deeply motivated by our shared mission, right? That is to make our world, our respective nations, and our communities safer and more secure places to violent ideological threats. For my brief time today, I want to share some just preliminary insights, some conclusions that have come from work that my colleagues and I, thank you. Yeah, that my colleagues and I have been doing on this question of repatriation and reintegration of foreign fighter families. This is a security challenge that's already been mentioned. It's a security challenge I think that everyone here will be familiar with. But it's such an important facet of this broader problem set of jihadism in the West. And I think particularly, as has already been mentioned, because of the case of the Islamic State, in which we saw this unprecedented surge, right, rise and mobilization of Western-based foreign fighters. So today, just bottom line up front, I'm going to argue that many of the stalemates that are hampering current repatriation and reintegration efforts are at least partly a function of how we conceptualize the life cycle and the unique experiences of the foreign fighter family. Then I'll be very glad to hand the mic back over to my colleagues and pick things up back up during the Q&A. Last week, news came out that SDF soldiers, in coordination with U.S. military, apprehended dozens of ISIS supporters living in the Al-Hol detention camp in northeastern Syria. For those of you unaware, Al-Hol is the largest of a small constellation of camps where persons affiliated with the Islamic State, as well as those who have been displaced by their violence, have been kept since the collapse of the territorial caliphate. This includes the families of suspected foreign terrorist fighters. Al-Hol currently hosts approximately or up to 60,000 persons, with up to 95% of those being women and children, 12 or over 50% of them being under the age of 12. In last week's operation, they found evidence of torture and of murder by detained ISIS supporters living in the camp against other detainees also living in the camp. 4 women were found chained, right, to a wall and were rescued by the operatives, thank God. But this underscored what has been a consistent narrative since the establishment of this camp and others like it, in that these conditions are only increasingly going from bad to worse. And this is as the world's nations have made a decision and are coming to a decision about what to do with the foreign fighter families who are detained in these spaces. So why does this matter? I think, put simply, the stakes are high. And not only that, the policy space here is highly complex. There are a variety of security and humanitarian concerns that overlap and also at times are competing with one another. And I think it's because of that that it's especially important that we get this question and answer right. For years, Western countries have been content to leave their citizens in this sort of indefinite state of detention, but the tides have changed, right? The question of repatriation is really no longer at the very center of debate and discussion. Under the last 2 presidential administrations, the U.S. has taken leadership in encouraging the world's nations to help empty these camps, to bring their fighters, their citizens back home. And we've seen many Western countries, certainly not all, but many following suit. And so I think for academics, for policymakers, especially those who are leaning forward to anticipate the next set of challenges, the core question now is no longer if this is going to happen, it's when and how. How do we repatriate and reintegrate the families of Western foreign fighters? Speaking to this question, we, and by we I mean our team of researchers, to include Insight, our partners at the Program on Extremism, as well as Julie Coleman at ICCT in the Netherlands, we've been working together to identify and promote best practices for the reintegration of foreign fighter spouses and children. We've been grateful in this to have the support of DHS Science and Technology Directorate. They've been an amazing partner in this work. We're about 1 year into this project with several months left to finalize and refine some of our key deliverables. But you can see here on the screen a number of products that have in the interim come out from this work and from this project. The core of the empirical work has come from a systematic scan of the academic literature and the policy literature, as well as some pointed case study analyses. In addition, with both my colleagues Devor Margolin and Hararo Ingram, I also just recently returned from the Netherlands and from Iraq, where we were conducting interviews with government officials, detained ISIS fighters and combatants, local tribal groups, and non-government entities who are helping to oversee and support the reintegration programming and reintegration process. And the point here is that the goal empirically is to triangulate this problem, to get word from and perspective from all of the stakeholders, right, that have a share in this problem set, both as a problem and as a solution. For us, this means establishing our work in the foundations of the foreign fighter problem. A framework that I've found particularly useful is thinking about the experiences of the foreign fighter family through the sort of three stages of their activity. That is, how and why foreign travelers bring their spouses and children with them, how they build and or maintain families while in theater, and then this fragmented nature of their return to their countries of origin. The life cycle of the foreign fighter family is really defined by these three stages, right? Pre-departure, in theater, and return. Daniel Milton, Lorenzo, Aaron Zellen, and others I know in this room have leveraged this approach, this framework in the past as well. So I'll go over this briefly. In that this first stage, in the pre-departure stage, we see the first glimpse of the foreign fighter family. And just to be clear, to establish this baseline, right, is that while most Western-based foreign fighters didn't initially bring their families with them, many did. And so this presents, right, in terms of scope, a significant problem set. Second is that once these families and fighters arrive in the conflict theater, they demonstrate a wide variety of experiences, in part because some arrived as an existent, cohesive family unit, and because others were being formed, right, actually in the conflict environment. For some foreign fighter families, this second stage lasted only 1 or 2 weeks, right? But for others, it lasted several years, and that adds nuance to this problem set as well. And third, the final stage is the point of return, where foreign fighters and or their spouses and children make their way back to their countries of origin. And so this question of those detained in camps like Al-Hol, right? These detained foreign fighter families are actually finding themselves sort of sandwiched between the second and third stages of this life cycle, right? Where they're not really typically in theater by way of behavior or experience, but neither are they returned. And it's this prolonged status of limbo that is, if not created, at least facilitated new security and humanitarian concerns. So where within this life cycle are the most pronounced and persistent knowledge gaps? Where do we still have room as academic practitioners, academics and practitioners as experts in this space? Where do we still have room to better understand in order to promote effective reintegration practice? I'd like to present 3 of these for your consideration. The first knowledge gap is a need for a better understanding of the interconnectivity of the foreign fighter family. This is all to say that addressing questions surrounding repatriation and reintegration requires a nuanced understanding of both children and women's or spouses' experience, both as individuals and as members of a larger family unit. In this context, the lives of the foreign fighter children all involve some level of coercion, manipulation, and abuse, of trauma. All foreign children should be, I believe, seen primarily as victims, right? Where some were integrated into the Islamic State's military efforts, others have been incorporated into political and propaganda campaigns. But in short, many foreign children will both have been perpetrators and survivors of violence, complicating efforts of assessing the risk, right, that they pose when reintegrated, reintegrating them into society, as well as treating the trauma that they may have experienced in theater and in detention. For women, the media is often used labels like jihadi brides, ISIS brides, right? But in practice, women have had a diverse range of experiences and of agency under ISIS rule, right? And while it's true that some have certainly sort of served this role of being married to ISIS fighters, one or multiple in the course of their time in theater, many others worked as doctors, as teachers, as key administrators of the administration behind the emerging Islamic State apparatus. Others, even more, right, joined and served in domestic security forces, receiving conventional military training and even supporting operations. Devorah Margolin, Joanna Cook, Gina Vale, all of these have done really, really brilliant work in this space to unpack this dynamic. And certainly the most recent, this case of Fluke Ekren, I think has brought some of these dynamics back to the forefront of mainstream conversation. As a second knowledge gap, it speaks to this issue of pathways of return. And the first, in other words, how do foreign fighter families get home? The first thing I want to flag here is that the means by which ISIS foreign fighter families return to their home countries has varied significantly, or at least meaningfully, between formal and informal pathways. For obvious reasons, I think public policy tends to emphasize the formal aspects of return, right, in which state agencies have a full monitoring and facilitating role from start to finish, right? But foreign fighters have also returned through less formal channels, right? Typically in similar methods to the way that they got to the theater in the first place. And so I believe that these cases, when we talk about reintegration practices and actual programming and policies, will require some nuance and greater attention. Okay, as a third knowledge gap is recognizing that we don't have a great sense of the long-term and short-term consequences of prolonged detention. And in some ways, this sort of point of detention between in theater and return almost is coming to represent this fourth stage of the foreign fighter family life cycle. In addition to the humanitarian crisis and growing political instability in these camps, there are several age and gender-based biases that may complicate this problem further. And I think this includes things like breaking up of families in the reintegration process or even during detention, minors being held alongside adults in prison camps and points of detention, as well as the increasing dynamic of minors becoming adults while still in detention. All of these further complicate just the legal apparatus, right, and also the practical reality of creating a universal reintegration policy and program. The fact that Western nations have shown some variation in their willingness to repatriate has also, I think, compounded this problem set. So out of these knowledge gaps, we've identified a few policy challenges that we think stem from this lack of understanding or lack of coherence across the international community. First, I'll just go over these briefly, are recognizing that there are policy cascades and complexities here. In other words, reintegration can't be treated in isolation, right? It is nested within a broader set of national security, humanitarian, right, considerations. It is inherently tied to policies related to counterterrorism, national security, immigration, citizenship, civil rights, civil liberties, social welfare, and in some cases, even health policy. Second, I think is going into this with eyes wide open and acknowledging, even at a programmatic level, that foreign fighter family management is controversial in many states, right, and can be a media magnet. This can make it difficult for countries and politicians to appeal to constituents. It creates an opportunity for malign influence actors to negatively sow mistrust, propaganda, misinformation that can hinder what would otherwise be effective policy design. Third is understanding the potential role and need for strategic communications to complement this process by using proactive messaging synchronized across multiple sectors and multiple actors. Like I mentioned, there are so many stakeholders at play here, and to incorporate those into this messaging, we believe may be essential to effective implementation. Again, this also recognizes that the reintegrated persons cannot be just treated as individuals, but they're going to be nested in this dyad, right, between where they're actually in relationship with their new host communities and creating and facilitating an environment and structure to maximize the probability of success is going to be really important, and communication can be a useful tool towards that end. Lastly, I'll just say briefly, and this is sort of taking more a step back at 33,000 feet, is that the threat and security environment is also actively changing, right? The decision-making environment isn't the same in 2022 that it was, right, closer to the actual collapse of the territorial caliphate. We're looking at a possible incursion of Turkish forces, the increasingly hostile behavior of the Islamic State in different parts of Iraq and Syria, placing it in a broader context of the geopolitical environment. Think about tensions or conflict in Ukraine, rising tensions in Taiwan, continued outfall or blowback from the COVID pandemic socially, economically, and politically also puts the reintegration question into a different context, and decision makers who are making decisions now have to take those into account. By way of summary and to conclude then, a few insights with respect to the study and where we're headed moving forward over the next couple of months is recognizing and understanding that the intersection of age and gender is going to be important to establishing a robust reintegration process. Second is guaranteeing a more synchronized parallel process, particularly when parents are brought back with children, and recognizing that those parents may often be prosecuted in criminal courts, creating a synchronous process and actually parallel, right, to the reintegration of both to include the criminal prosecution at times of the parent. Third is acknowledging the politicalization and sort of second order stigmatization that can come from this for those who are being returned, and just providing a good faith opportunity for those who are being brought back to become productive members of society, as that is the ultimate metric, right, and outcome of these programs. And finally is a holistic approach. There can certainly be national level policy, but on the ground this is going to be done at a local level in many Western countries, and making sure clear lines of communication between local implementers, right, and national level political and policy authorities is going to be essential to effective outcomes with respect to repatriation and reintegration. We're in the process of formalizing these results in the way of a decision-making support framework, some training materials for those who will oversee this process in the United States. Again, it is critical that we get this right. And to motivate this further, it's not just for the current cases of returning ISIS fighters and their families, right? This is not the end of foreign fighting. This is not the end. We're going to need effective tools, I believe, for reintegration moving forward, and the time to do this is now. Thank you for your time, the opportunity. I look forward to more discussion in the Q&A.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you very much. Katja?
Just making sure that there's slides, I hope. Otherwise, I have to say, as you can see in the picture, excellent. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn this down a little bit. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and to be in such esteemed company. I have to mention I'm notoriously bad at gauging time, so I think I probably need to be interrupted at some stage. Yeah, my name's Katja. I come from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and I'll be talking today about, I guess, some of the local flavors of jihadism, and it's playing with the idea of what are the connections to sort of the assumed centers of jihad. How does this play out in a place as far away as Australia? The proximity of Australia to Southeast Asia is quite an interesting factor, which I won't be speaking about today, because I felt like I couldn't do it justice in just a cursory treatment, and there are people far better qualified to speak about this, because there's nuance there that you have to be an expert on to kind of draw that out. But I think talking about it in a more broader framework of how maybe we should understand jihad as an analytical category, and in terms of motivational factors, I think it would make sense to then look at Southeast Asia separately. Without further ado, once I get my notes up here we go. Here we go. There have been some other studies when we've looked at jihadism in the West. One of them, that's sort of the inspiration that, Anwar al-Awlaki, the great ideologue and sort of modern day resistance ideologue, he was described as American as apple pie. He spoke with, very locally flavored accent. And his ideas would resonate because he had that local background. It was culturally convincing. We've also had, some of the jihadi genre, some of the executioners, when they spoke with these really localized sort of London accents as they're beheading someone, I think that really drove it home, that it felt like, well, hang on. They could have been in the streets in London a few weeks ago, and there were discussions going on in jihadi forums, people planning to go around that time, going, should I cancel my gym membership in this gym in London? Or what trainers should I bring? you kind of go, that's a discussion that you would have had in our context. So there's not this barrier of this exotic otherness there. And then what's the Australian flavor of jihad playing with that? We have a very blonde jihadi there, for example. There was a ginger jihadi. So a lot of it was also about physical appearances because people didn't look like your typical jihadi. And I think that also stoked some fears that there might be in our midst. What is happening here? Where now the blue-eyed blonde kid from the Gold Coast is all of a sudden joining jihad. So I want to play around with this. This is where the picture came from. At the beginning, we actually had a plot where someone wanted to load. It was a foiled plot, foiled in very early stages, thankfully. But a young man wanted to pack a kangaroo full of explosives and release it into a crowd, especially Anzac Day, which is sort of commemoration of the Gallipoli defeat in the First World War. It's a big deal in Australia. It kind of binds us to our security allies, the US and New Zealand, and it's very symbolic. For a terrorism target, I reckon that's what you'd be going for if you want to have the major impact. But his name, and the interesting thing about him was too, it kind of highlights this, he had connections. He was motivated by a fatwa that was issued by an Islamic State leader, and he wanted to deliberately target soldiers and police officers and intelligence services. And his friend, Newman Haider, actually, he was also very young. He actually attacked 2 joint counter-terrorism police officers at a police station in Sydney. So that was kind of his network. Newman Haider was of Afghan origin, and there was quite a bit was sort of made of these really young jihadis. And I think he was quite young himself, and he was also communicating with a radicalized British boy who was only 14 years old, who I think he's since I think he even got a life sentence. And that kind of shows those connections, but again, with this Australian flavor, because I don't know if a British jihadi would be thinking of packing a kangaroo full of explosives. But I think it challenges our thinking a little bit too when we look at this recent cohort of Australian jihadis. And I'm only referring to the period of sort of 2013-14 onwards, because for time reasons, but also that was a different kind of mobilizational wave, for lack of a better word there. Go back. Because it was a different kind of appeal that a physical caliphate all of a sudden had. Someone who would have, in earlier years, we had David Hicks, who spent time at Guantanamo Bay. His appeal, the way Al-Qaeda would have appealed to him would have been similar in some ways, but also different, because it took a lot more preparation, took a lot more sacrifice. It was something, it would have made you very lonely, and already before you went, you would have not been part of necessarily mainstream society anymore, at least in your head. Whereas this, what we saw there was a lot of times they would be at school one day, and the next day involved in something, or making those connections because the boundaries were blurred, because the radicalization hubs, again, for lack of a better word, there was a lot more, was not as clear cut as before in terms of, someone's communicating with a network overseas and they're making preparations, they're dropping the emails into the drafts folder, so that classic, it was quite different, and it would be from maybe being vocal also in classrooms about certain topics, and then quite quickly, when sort of opportunities on the ground presented themselves, go on to act on this. Just a little bit of just sort of conceptual stuff, because what I'm trying to get with this before we look at the Australian cases is I think it invites us to look at a maybe slightly adapted definition of jihadism sort of for that age. This is one way of looking at it. It's a French sociologist, which I think is quite helpful, because he's saying it actually incorporates narratives that come from different, from left-wing extremisms, this kind of anti-imperialism. There are some deep conservative traits there. But it's inviting us to look at it in a broader way. There's an Australian scholar, Pete Lentini. He has called this neo-jihadism, which I think it's very similar, and it's very useful, I think, to look at this as something a bit more hybrid, which is also then useful to look at it in terms of what are people's radicalization journeys, because sometimes you get this, well, I don't understand, they were never really religious, or some of the foreign fighters crossing, I think, into ISIS territory, a lot was made of one having sort of an Islam for Dummy book in his luggage, and they go like, but how can they're not actually religiously knowledgeable, they're not really understanding this, and so how can they now go? Because it's not, I think seeing religion sort of this in this doctrinal, ideological sense, I think it's misleading, or it's too narrow at least. So it's just some different ways, and I absolutely agree with the points that were made before, that we can't look at sort of online radicalization as a distinct phenomenon from offline radicalization. So that's the caveat here, but I think it's an interesting one to think through, that when we have sort of the internet on offer where we can just download things, and the salad bar of extremism, common by, I think, a former FBI, head of the FBI, that you can sort of pick and choose. It's a bit of a mashup, so to speak, and I think that's really helpful in understanding this, because the boundaries are not as strict as they were before, maybe. And I think that phenomenon when the loss of Afghanistan to the Taliban, for example, all of a sudden you would get a lot of right-wing groups or sort of alt-right adherents now praising Taliban and the memes of Taliban Chad, and thinking we have a lot with these guys in common because they're really buff like we are, and they're also just defending their homeland. They're patriots like we are. Never mind that they were like seen as the big enemy like maybe 10 years ago. There's literally now sort of patriot groups expressing solidarity with the cause of the Taliban, and I think our existing lenses don't really help us understand why. I mean, I think some of those things, those big conceptual lenses, they may help with that. But back to the Australian jihadis and sort of that identity that comes from maybe our distinct cultural environment. That's just a little dress-up beard you can buy at IKEA. It has nothing to do with fundamentalism, but it kind of looked like it. You could just sort of dress up as a Salafi jihadi for the next party. So we'll go a little bit into who they were, just kind of exemplify that, wanting to draw down on typologies where we're now going, okay, we have this data set now, and we can now tell that most of the people who became terrorists in Syria, Iraq, they were converts, or these were their radicalization factors, and now we have to target that when we want to prevent things. That's sort of exactly what I think we need to get away from and not be so sure, but look at this a bit more broadly. He was the poster boy, and his story is still ongoing too, because we're that, how did you put it? There are others that are more resistant countries. I think Australia is the typical example for, we're very resistant. It's not a good story, fighting with other countries over who's responsible for him, and in the meantime, he's sort of at large a little bit, and shows that citizenship stripping is really not that helpful. I would say he was maybe the closest to sort of the appeal of an Anwar al-Awlaki, because of the way he came across quite sophisticated, and he was articulating how his identity, his mixed identity, how that put him at odds with not just mainstream society in terms of being Muslim, but even then within that there were gradients of being rejected or not being seen, and kind of really makes it a very convincing argument that you're saying the West, there's no place for anyone that looks different. And I think that reaffirms some other narratives. That's a really sad story, Jake Biladi. Suicide attack. Someone at an earlier counter-terrorism conference made the comment saying, if this had been a different age and there was no ISIS and no internet, he may have joined like a radical student organization and became like maybe a Marxist or something, but he would have not radicalized to become a suicide bomber. His blog is really fascinating. I've taken some excerpts from there and showed them to students at the university, and I said, what do you think this is? And they thought it was a really critical evaluation of, US imperialism, and they thought it was quite good. It's what he wrote, and a few months later, he was ready to commit a suicide attack. He's often seen as being way too soft. And so then you get others that you could see early on. This was called the ginger jihadi, because having red hair apparently is also a source of amusement, not just in Australia where you get made fun of, but also in the caliphate. But he was, from an early age, or his trajectory, there was a lot more violence in there. There was a lot more, it was more logical that someone with his trajectory would end up doing what he did. And even people were saying, he's such a dork. He doesn't really represent us as like this new vanguard of jihadis. So it just kind of goes to show that there is no mold. This is a very interesting one. I put jihadi in sort of quotation marks because he was targeted under foreign fighter legislation. We had prescribed declared area offenses, so they made it illegal to go with Raqqa and Mosul. They're not in place anymore, but by being there, already you had broken the law. He was stripped of he wasn't stripped of his citizenship because he didn't have another one, but his passport was canceled and he got stuck somewhere. Police don't like to talk about it, his whereabouts. There's no public knowledge of where he is. I'm sure there's more to that story, but he actually never fought for ISIS. He went to an area that was controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra, but he said he didn't go there to join them. His jihad was more of an altruistic one. He worked with on-the-ground news, I think someone, or an NGO that run out of Britain, of course with links to all those groups operating in Idlib province, but he said he never went there to fight, and he may be one of those cases where that's actually credible. He said he was motivated by the plight of the Syrian people. He was a convert, he converted in high school, and he said, I'm just here to help. He did several videos and interviews with, I think, on-the-ground news, Bilal Karim. So his case also shows he was classified like the same bloodthirsty ISIS terrorist like everyone else, and he was also treated, I think, in terms of investigations and the risk, how he was assessed. There was no distinction made necessarily. Yes, great. He was quite infamous too. And he was there were earlier sort of indications of sort of maybe some narcissistic or like sort of pathologies in his trajectory, where people thought he's already treated people with a lot of disrespect or disregard for other human beings in his surroundings. It's not surprising that he ended up there. That's what some of the people in his peer group said when these videos of him emerged. The interesting ones, Khalid Sharif, whose son infamously was portrayed with a severed head, and Mohammed Al-Omar, they come from really large networks where police look at this in Western Sydney, and they have the family tree up, and it's pretty. It just kind of stays within the family, and it's not surprising that the cousin would also radicalize, which presented some challenges also when it came to reintegrating. The only children that were reintegrated so far were actually the Sharif children and grandchildren. There was a lot of publicity behind it. The grandmother went several times and managed to get them back, but it was easy because both parents had passed away, the mother also, and so they came back as orphans, and so there was not this risk. I'm not saying that children weren't treated as possible perpetrators, they weren't, but it was assessed that it was the lowest risk possible, and they just were reintegrated. Not a whole lot of it is known. I think the authorities are keeping that quite restricted. He was a networker. Again, people thought he was a bit of a dog, but he was responsible for getting a lot of people there and kind of on the ground. He starred in some, sort of underbelly hit. He was an extra there, and he kind of had that gangster identity, very different. We have no time to get into the women. I deliberately called them caliphates and not jihadi brides. Complex story. This is where I'm going to probably be a little bit over time. I'm just going to wrap this up in 1 minute. But Musa Serantonio is, I think, the interesting case in the sense that he was Catholic, he also converted, and he became quite sort of an influential sort of sheikh. He was even in Egypt for a number of years. He was in TV shows. He put out a sermon that was broadcast on some Islamist channel in India. And he really developed a following where he was very knowledgeable, maybe not as knowledgeable as other scholars in that area that actually had really intimate knowledge of doctrines. They say it was quite superficial, and he would, in his videos, they were just peppered with inshallah and using sort of buzzwords. But I think he had that, again, thinking of what Anwar al-Awlaki was able to do, I think he really resonated. He was also called part of the gang of the Counter-Terrorists. They tried to make their way up to the north of Australia, towing a very small boat and trying to get over to the Philippines again. And they all got arrested. He's currently, I think he's got 10 more years. There are rumors that he's renounced Islam altogether, but his influence is really interesting, which is kind of bringing me to my conclusion, because it sounded like he was very, very doctrinal in the way he was trying to persuade people, and why there was this need for violence now, and why we had to all join the caliphate if you're a good Muslim. But it was still that the underlying narratives were a lot more just anti-Western and closed in jihadi language. But what he was using, and I think had that mobilizing appeal. and maybe where Australia is, as much as we're very far away, maybe that element is sort of something that's quite distinct, and where maybe Australian jihadists had some leadership potential there. That kind of appropriation or cultural repackaging for a new age of some of the mobilizing ideas of radical Islamism. And so, you could use something that, say, Katja had said about, America, the great big whore, and this kind of decay of morality, but then making it quite fit for our age, and especially when you're doing that with a particular accent from Western Sydney, where a lot of this, those Muslims networks were, or you can connect that to something that's happening in Melbourne, and that just shows the decay of morals. I think that has a lot more resonance. It's kind of a new form, sort of 2.0 Jahiliyyah. And that is something that's also not necessarily just a characteristic of jihadis, but you would probably find that just across the board, and it's mainstream attitudes a lot as well. And whether that's with a Muslim flavor or not, I think that's sort of where I would be looking when we're thinking, sorry, I didn't want to get into all of it, also about what comes next, what comes down the road, and what other forms of violence and extremism does it actually inspire? Some of the themes, like no trust in authorities, the current order is corrupt. I think those are some of the dominant themes, just with a distinct cultural and religious flavor. Thank you. I'll leave it there, and I probably went way over time. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. Last but definitely not least, Aimen.
You will be relieved to know there will be no slides. Well, today I'm going to have a tough act, following on what my distinguished colleagues here said. But I'm going to leave you today with 3 stories and 3 themes, and you will understand why I'm talking about them, because they are very relevant to what my friends here talked about today. I'm going to talk about money. I'm also going to talk about prophecy. And in the end, I'm going to talk about Abu Mus'ab al-Suri. So these are the 3 stories I'm going to talk about. In November, well, actually, no, I'll make it April. Okay, so we go back to April of 2010. There was an event in April 2010 when the Iraqi forces were able to finally surround and kill Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, the leader of the ISI, or the Islamic State of Iraq at that time, and to also manage to kill Abu Hamza al-Muhajir, the military commander of the ISI. So April 19, 2010, and the Al-Qaeda's branch in Iraq, the ISI, was almost written off as a footnote in history. It's gone, and people thought that the leadership was decimated when the Emir of the ISI, when the military commander of the ISI were killed. Everyone had a sigh of relief. The issue here is that in May, a new leader was chosen by the Shura Council, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was chosen as the leader of the ISI. Now, in November that year, and I'm not going into details, it's just too long, but I just come across a useful piece of information about what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi did in order to ensure the long-term survival of the ISI. The information that came to me stated that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi looked at the finances of the ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, and he understood at the time that there were about roughly $120 million in cash with them. That is, by the way, a leftover from $340 million that Zarqawi, was able to, get his hand on around 2003. So there was a problem, as many of you know, if you work in banking. The dollars that Zarqawi had at that time were from the Iraqi Central Bank, just before the US invasion. So they are the 2002, 2003 edition. So they are what you call the greenish white dollars. But at that time, with the imminent introduction of the new dollars, which is the bluish green one, these notes are going to be out of circulation. It's not going to be accepted anymore. And so therefore, in late 2010, with 2011 coming and the introduction of the bluish-green dollar, the ISI realized that if they launder that money as soon as possible, then they will lose it. And so they immediately put together a plan in order to distribute this $120 million among 100 dedicated cells. Each cell will be ordered to purchase a business. So that business could be anything from farms to small transport companies, butcher shops, tailor shops, restaurants, cafes. These businesses, and of course, car garages for repairs, these businesses were spread all over Iraq, including farms, by the way. So from Mosul all the way down to Baghdad and going into the Anbar province. And the reality is that these businesses, some of them, I don't know, was it just them holding the middle finger to the Iraqi government? They actually purchased them next to the Ministry of Defense, to the Ministry of Interior, and they were bugging the tables of these cafes and restaurants, and they were listening actually to everything that these officers, were uttering during their, breaks. Now, at that time when this information was passed, to the UK Foreign Office, the answer came back that maybe, just maybe, that this is a deliberate propaganda, internal propaganda by the ISI to convince their followers that they are still there, they're still relevant, they are still having a presence around. And the reason is because there is no corroborating evidence. This is, I must say, impressed by how much, the ISI was able to keep this, intact. The reality is that the events 2.5 years later, when in early 2013 they were able, within short space of time, to break out 6,000 of their followers from 3 high security jails across Iraq, is a testament to the level of sophistication in the logistical network and the intelligence network they created based on the money they laundered through the Iraqi commercial system. Because how could you break out 6,000 people and none of them are caught again? Unless if you have a considerable network of farms to hide them. How would you secure 18,000 meals a day for them? How would you arm them and then send them to Syria in order to fight? So what is the moral of the story here? The fact is that during that time, it was the time of a lull. It was the time when between 2009 all the way until 2011, it was a time when jihadist activities all across the world and even the jihadist insurgencies were starting to plateau and to some degree decline. But what we didn't understand at the time, well, actually, some understood, but not many, that this plateau was in fact nothing short of an aggressive hibernation. And it was enabled because of the fact that they used that cash wisely in order to create that network which enabled their survival during a time when everyone was writing them off as a has-been organization. So what do we learn from that? Now, how much cash, of ISIS, how much cash is missing right now? Between 400 and 450 million US dollars. And it's understood that the same network that they created in Iraq, and to some extent the KRG, between 2009 and 2013, being replicated in Turkey, and to some extent among some in the diaspora in European countries, including Germany and others. So the reality is that as long as the financial infrastructure is not disrupted and it's not being followed and pursued, because it's a boring matter, and it's a matter in which, like, the people who are experienced and are rare and to find, it's difficult then to say that we have more or less defeated ISIS and that their return in the future, if there is a conflict in the region or a collapse again of political discourse in Iraq or in Syria or other neighboring countries, it means that their return is inevitable. So unless, if we understand fully, the importance of the financial network that they have created, and without going after the money, unfortunately, it's difficult to prevent a return, of that. The other aspect, apart from money, which I wanted to talk about, is prophecy, is eschatology. And I will tell a story here again, but this time I have to go back all the way to 1996. And I feel old already when I say 1996. 1996 in August, just a week or two earlier, I was at the time a young, trainee in one of the camps in Afghanistan in Nangarhar province when we heard the news that Bin Laden and his entourage, they landed in Jalalabad airport coming from Sudan. And they were staying in one of the compounds in Yunus Khalis camp. And he was asking if there are any people from the Arabian Peninsula who were around. And our camp was only 45 minutes drive. And so we drove to see him. There were 14 of us. And, the image that people always remember when we mention the name Osama bin Laden is of someone who is wearing these neat robes, well ironed, no crease whatsoever, and well presented, and he's looking well rested. But the Osama bin Laden, myself and the people who were with me encountered, it was really different. The robes were so creased. He looked disheveled. He was wearing the red Arabic scarf, but it was wrapped around his head, and it wasn't neat at all. And everywhere around the compound, you see boxes and suitcases, and they looked like a bunch of refugees. Now, what does this to do with prophecy? And the reality is, when he started talking to us, and he was able to read our faces, that we were skeptical of what he was saying. Of course, he was trying to put a brave face on the fact that he's just been betrayed by al-Bashir and al-Turabi in Sudan and been told to leave. But he put a spin on it, which is that it is a divine plan. It is the divine, prophetic plan that brought him all the way from Sudan to Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is going to play an important role in the prophecies that been foretold in ancient Islamic texts. And he even proceeded to call Afghanistan Khorasan in order to correspond with the prophecies of the black flags and the armies coming out of Khorasan, which are, of course, I don't want to go into details. They are disputed in Islamic history. It's mostly an Abbasid dynasty propaganda, but nonetheless, they seeped into Islamic textbooks. They seeped into Islamic imagination, and they fed both the Sunni and the Shia fascination with Mahdi. So he was trying to give the impression that he is the person who is going to, and his followers with him, to instigate the rise of the Mahdism and the Islamic eschatological apocalyptic armies that will come out of Afghanistan and seep and just basically sweep through all the way to the Middle East, to liberate the Middle East from the American influence. So America was ever present in his mind, and to liberate Muslim lands, especially the Arabian Peninsula, from what he called the American invasion and occupation of it. Again, the skepticism were there still, and he can see that. And he said, yes, we might look like a bunch of refugees here. But he said, remember that when the Prophet Muhammad was escaping with his own life from Mecca, trying to seek the safety of Medina, and the Arab tribes were putting a bounty on his head, and he was a fugitive in the desert. When one night almost caught up with him trying to claim the bounty, but he failed, and yet the Prophet said, well, if you let me reach the safety of Medina, I promise you something. There is something in return for you. And the knight said, what can you offer me? You are a fugitive in the desert. So he said that I can promise you the crown and the bracelets of the Persian emperor. Well, the knight scoffed at him. He said, you're a fugitive in the desert and you are threatening the might of Persia. He said, I can put it for you in writing. And so he instructed his companion to put it for him in writing. 16 years later, that Bedouin was sitting on the throne of the Persian emperor in Setefan, and he was wearing his crown and bracelets. So he was trying to tell us, using the power of eschatology, the power of prophecy, that we might be a bunch of refugees, but we're going to change history. And I remember the person sitting next to me, Abu Ubaid al-Makki, was almost in tears. He was in awe. And he was just another 17-year-old, just like me. 2 years later, to the day, when we were sitting with him, it was August 4 of 1996. August 4, 1998, that same young man was driving the van into the American embassy in Nairobi. And 5 years and 1 month later, they did change history with 9/11. So eschatology is important because this is what I wanted to highlight with what all my colleagues here said today, that while Chairman Mao said that religion is the opium of the masses, which I disagree, I'm still a religious person, but in a spiritual sense, but eschatology truly is the opium of the radicals, because that is how they get high on all what they believe to be right and true. They truly believe that everything they do is an execution of God's divine blueprint for this conflict that is happening between them and their apostate leaders, between them and the aggressive crusading Zionist West, and all of that. So eschatology is something that Bin Laden, and the jihadists in Afghanistan started. The ISIS doctrine then took it into even a greater level of toxicity, and this is how the ensnaring and the seduction, the intellectual and religious and spiritual seduction of many young people who were mostly unaware of their own faith, that if you want to be forgiven for all the sins that you committed, for all the Western lifestyle that you have followed, if you are in prison for all the crimes that you have done, the path to forgiveness will come through sacrificing your life in order to be an instrument of God in fulfilling the prophetic text that has been revealed in the past. So without understanding the power of eschatology and the power of prophecy in corrupting the minds of these young people, without trying to remove that residue from their minds, unfortunately, they are just going to be sleeper cells until they are reactivated in the future. So this is why, without having a healthy dose of challenging the power of prophecy and its corrupting influence in their minds, it's not going to work. You have to drive it completely out of their minds through healthy dose of doubt and skepticism, and educating them that most of these prophecies are in fact a fabrication by the Abbasid dynasties that actually seeped into the mindset of, and the books, unfortunately, of both Shia and Sunni Islam is just one of the residues that kept building and piling up over 200 years of history. The last story I want to tell is in 1999. It's December, it's cold, it's in Kabul, and Wazir Akbar Khan, it's in the house of Abu Mus'ab al-Suri. Now, a show of hands here, who knows who Abu Mus'ab al-Suri is? Okay, so Abu Mus'ab al-Suri is an ideologue for the jihadist movement. He was not a fully member of Al-Qaeda, he was just an associate, but he lived in Kabul between 1997 under the protection of the Taliban all the way until 2001. And he was a pioneer of the lone wolf jihad. So if anyone talks about lone wolf jihad, it was something that he pioneered throughout the year 1999. And he is the one, during a time when I spent 4 months in his house in Kabul, and as his, I used to work for him actually at that time. And one of the things, that was present in his house were, well, apart from the annoying, frogs that were, all the time, like, being annoying there, in the background with their sounds, waking me up all the night. But the other thing that was always present there is the presence of so many of these jihadi thinkers who were always talking about the evolution of jihad and the need to understand that while in Afghanistan the jihad is to maintain the Taliban rule, the importance is that the West should never experience any semblance of peace. And that can only happen not through concerted, centralized effort, because that can always be disrupted, but only by the encouragement of the lone wolf attack, because the lone wolf attack is independent. It is not going to be instigated by a central command, and it is always by, invading what he called at that time the intellectual space of individuals through books and through leaflets. Of course, at the time there was no Twitter, there was no dissemination of internet, but of course with the dissemination of the internet and with the information age, now an individual like Abu Mus'ab al-Suri and hundreds of his followers can invade countless homes and living rooms and bedrooms and phones because of the information revolution that we are experiencing today. So lone wolf was always designed to be a tactic used against what he called the hostile countries. Because hostile countries are not only just, in his opinion, Western countries, because this could include Russia, this could include China, this could include any state that at some point will be engaging in war against Islam as they see it. Like, remember, like 1999, it was the height of the Russian, Chechen war, the second Russian-Chechen war at that time, and he was talking about it. So it's important, therefore, and I conclude here, that with these three stories, why they are relevant is because money, so in the financial front, it's important to confront in order to prevent the return to the dark old days of terrorism in our streets, whether it is in the Middle East or in the Western societies. So chasing the money is important, but also in the intellectual field, without removing the toxic effect of eschatology, without challenging it intellectually and theologically enough in order to discredit that method of recruitment, it will always come back to haunt us. And finally, understanding that the lone wolf phenomenon is what even jihadists at that time advocated in 1999, is because they advocated that to be solely used against hostile countries, which is the West. And therefore, coming back to the idea that individual recruitment is vital, and actually triggering individuals to just adopt that and then do the effort on their own is the ultimate aim. They are, I think, giving up on the idea of spectaculars, although they might try, but the lone wolf is always going to be the most cost-effective tactic they are going to pursue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aimen. This is a wonderful way of concluding our panel. I think we have some 10-15 minutes together still. I just want to try to do the impossible, which is try to put some common threads among 5 phenomenal presentations we've had. I think what I see all panelists agreeing upon is the fact that we are in this stage of momentary lull, in these ebbs and flows I talked about in the very beginning, if we look at the history of jihadism. But this is not going away. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but it's clearly that we are talking about an ideology. I think I like the way both Liam and Katja talked about a culture, an identity, a local flavor, a lifestyle. This is not going away. It might take different directions. Ido emphasized sort of the continuity, diversity, but continuity of thinking in jihadism. The movement reinvents itself, fights internally, intellectually for what the next steps should be, but it persists. Austin, of course, talked about the challenges that countries face in reintegrating people who participated to one specific struggle, but as he concluded in his remarks, these are challenges we're going to face in the future as well, and we need to get it right to face those challenges. And I love the aggressive hibernation, as Aimen called it, the stage that we have seen in the past. 2008, 2009, 2010, we deluded ourselves that this was gone, manageable. It clearly wasn't, and I think I see a lot of similarities, and we are probably also now in a stage of aggressive hibernation. Several of you spoke about the importance of ideology, of eschatology, of ideas, and I think this is crucially important, and I know we at the program try to do a lot of work on that, emphasize that aspect. IDC does a lot of that in not looking just at the kinetic aspects of terrorism, and if we refuse for a variety of reasons to get into the ideas of what drives individuals to embrace a certain cause, we're not going to be able to tackle the phenomenon. This doesn't apply just to jihadism, it applies to any kind of extremist ideology. But I think at times, if this is more from an American and to some degree European, but definitely American perspective, we do look at the ideology that moves right-wing extremism. We talk about sort of the mood music, the environment that produces right-wing extremism, the non-violent side that then generates, in some cases, the violent ones. We are at times reluctant to do that when it comes to jihadism and looking at the broader picture of non-violent Islamism that at times produces the conducive environment for jihadists. Several other issues that I take on the concept of hubs. Again, we've got the idea of ideology and who do you know, how individuals are connected by ideas and by common social networks. The importance of both online and offline aspects. I think this is probably, and I love it, it was one of the few panels I've seen over the last few years where the online aspect was, yes, mentioned, but it was emphasized by all of you as being just one component and not necessarily the key component of what we're trying to look, and the diversity of profiles of people who get attracted by this ideology. I can go on and ramble, but I think the fairest thing to do to you all is to take questions in the, as I said, remaining 10 minutes. I'll be very strict on that. I wasn't strict with them, but I will be strict with you in terms of asking a question and not making a speech. So if you can briefly raise your hands, say who you are, and make a very, very short question. We'll take 3 at a time. Start 1, 2, 3.
My name's George Braidberg. I'm from Australia. And I just wanted to ask Katja, we have I guess a tradition of really embracing the larrikin in the Australian society. We came from a country of convicts. We've always been anti-establishment for a long time. And we had a rebellion against the government in the Eureka Stockade, and often in Australia you'll see Eureka Stockade flags at these sorts of protests. So I guess my question is really about the romanticism of being a larrikin, being outside of normal society, and how much of that romantic image is a potential reason why people might look towards jihadism or any other sort of extremist group.
Got it. Perfect. Let's take this second. Let's bundle them and then we get to you. Yeah, second.
Hello to you all. My name is Yaniv. I want to ask Aimen and maybe other colleagues about the differences between the hijra that al-Baghdadi called against the hijra that al-Qaeda opposed. Because we saw the hijra that ISIS, when al-Baghdadi killed the emissaries in al-Qaeda, that sends to Syria and then pledged the caliphate himself, it's generated, motivated all around the world. Between Australia and the United States and in Denmark and Sweden, and then became a really huge phenomena. Regarding the Al-Qaeda Hijra that observe maybe domestic, maybe other Arabs, if you can enlighten us about this phenomena.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rob Wallace from the Marshall Center in Germany. So accepting the axiom that terrorists are being formed in micro-communities and that they're following particular narratives, what can governments do and what ought government to do in order to affect and or change and or mitigate both the effect of those communities and those narratives?
Okay. Let's go with the answers. Let's go. Maybe Katja, you start, and then there's questions for everybody else, whoever wants.
Another question, thank you. And I think you really hit the nail on the head there, because that's our cultural spirit of yeah, thank you. Is that on? Yeah. That's kind of our particular, brand of rebellion. And, as an ex-penal colony, we're kind of proud of that, right? But it doesn't just mean that it's sort of far removed from us. I think it's in our culture, and to distance ourselves from, other parts of the English-speaking world. And I think when we're talking about people that have grown up in Australia, they've lived there, that would be part of you, whether you want it or not. You're influenced by your environment. And I think in that sense, the ghost of Ned Kelly is pretty strong. And I think that's across the board, just with this form of jihadism that we've seen. It was sort of the clothes it was wearing looked like they were completely exotic. It was a self-contained phenomenon. And because it was religion, there's this fanaticism and nihilism is like, yeah, but that's like a pathology. But now I feel like we're seeing the same rebellion. Like I was sort of at the protests, that convoy to Canberra, those freedom convoys we've had in Canada and New Zealand and Europe. It was the same narratives, that same underlying, resistance against the powers that be, and the same, especially with some of those conspiracy narratives and myths, they're the same ones, and sort of the way anti-Semitism is being sort of reimagined in different ways, and people don't even realize it, how anti-Semitic something is, and it's coming from, the left. I think Germany is one of the few countries that has made these distinctions. There is the anti-Semitism, that's the classical neo-Nazi one where, the end goal is Auschwitz, but then there's also sort of this anti-Semitism of, pro-Palestinian rallies, of anti-imperialism. Then there is the anti-Semitism that's with the vaccines now, where people now feel like then we need Nuremberg too, and they're like victims like that. I think those are all symptoms of exactly that, and I think that's where I would be looking, how recruiters or how new movements tap into that zeitgeist in a sense.
Who wants to take the other questions? They're more open. I got Liam.
Is that working? Yeah. It was a question about the micro-communities and what state can do, essentially. I don't know if I've got a direct answer to that, because it's seriously challenging. It says if people aren't committing terrorist acts, if they're not committing crimes, then, what legitimacy do we have? I think there are examples in some European countries, and Lorenzo knows a lot more about this than I do, but if you look at France and Austria in particular, France has got what became famous as like an anti-separatism law, which became, I think they renamed it as the law for strengthening Republican values. So it's really about asserting the Republic's values over the values that exist in those micro-communities. The problem is that can't necessarily be replicated in every country. In my own country or the United States, for example, individual liberty takes primacy over protection of the Republic and the Constitution, like it does in France. So I'm not sure what France is doing could be replicated in the United Kingdom, for example, and certainly not in the United States. The other challenges Lorenzo talked about, Islamist groups producing a conducive environment, and I actually think it's more than that. And I've been watching this this is the first time I've been alive during one of these ebbs and flows, or intellectually of age, shall we say, to actually think about it during these ebbs and flows, during these low periods. You actually, when jihadists are on the front foot and launching attacks like we saw against Bataclan and other places like that, Islamist groups tend to distance themselves from jihadists. But when we're in a low period like we are now, you actually see the overlap, like real physical overlap between Islamist groups and jihadists to a much greater extent. And we saw it with the response to France's anti-separatism law. Islamist groups were running interference for jihadists around that non-stop. They drummed up support among Middle Eastern countries to target France. They drummed up a boycott of French goods. They painted France as, an evil Islamophobic country. And you see it in the UK now with the repatriation of foreign fighters or terrorist detainees and actual genuine convicted terrorists. Islamist groups will lobby on their behalf when they're in prison. So there are actually genuine overlaps and coordination between Islamist and jihadist groups. They just tend to happen during these low periods rather than the high periods when they have to distance themselves. So sorry, I don't have a direct answer because I honestly don't know what the answer is if people aren't committing a crime, but there are some emerging examples from some countries.
Want to say something, Aimen? Yeah.
The Hijra question, I think.
Please.
Is it working? Okay, it's working, yeah. Okay, so for the Hijra question, what is the difference between, by the way, the word Hijra in Arabic means migration. So what is the difference between Al-Qaeda's and ISIS Hijra? Well, you have to understand the fundamental difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Al-Qaeda is for the elite. Al-Qaeda is, for the patricians. Yes, we are the cool people, the vanguards, yes, the elite, the vanguard. You forsake all familial ties and everything, get rid of your business, just come and join us in the mountains and fight, and you are the part of the elite. And that's why, I remember, in Al-Qaeda's camps, who you will find? You will find university graduates. You will find, people who came out of, religious schools. You will find people who were in the armies before, military or security services or accountants. And even we had dentists, with us, basically. So dentists can be evil in both ways, being dentists and also being a jihadist at the same time. So, so this is what Al-Qaeda camp will have. But then, if you go to the hijra that, al-Baghdadi said, because al-Baghdadi created the territory. Al-Qaeda, just as, as Ido said, al-Qaeda didn't want to create a territory. They wanted to fight in the mountains. They wanted to fight in the urban settings. They wanted to be in valleys or in safe houses. They did not want, they wanted a life on the run. And so a hijra is really for the individual, for that individual, person who wants to be a part of the elite vanguard with no burden. However, al-Baghdadi decided to put as Al-Qaeda would think, put the cart before the horse and created a state and with it a territory. And therefore, now the hijra is for all. So the plebs came. Not only the plebs, but also with them, came the criminal classes. Graduates not of dentistry schools, but maybe better, criminal classes from the prisons. So and you end up in a situation where people who are less educated, who sometimes are with criminal backgrounds, ignorant, so ignorant of their own faith, so ignorant of their what is right and wrong in societal sense. People who were in gangs, people who which is true in many cases, would have joined. And the hijra of Al-Qaeda, was more for the elite, for those who want to become warrior monks, while the hijra of ISIS, look, you were a psychopathic sadist before, but it was haram, illegal. Now you can come and practice your sadism and psychopathic tendencies on all halal. You can come and just do it, and you can bring your family with you because now we are a territory. You can bring your baggage with you. You can transport your life, as it is, from Luton or Marseille or from Cologne all the way there and just move houses. And it's going to be a life where you can exercise that sense of statistic empowerment that you always sought, there in the new territory that we have conquered. It's two different visions completely.
Perfect. I think we have one more question. Really the last one I can take. I'm getting looks from...
I have no microphone, but I'm usually very loud. I wanted to say that coming from North Macedonia, I represent the civil society and we work with women and children returnees that we had a group return to North Macedonia. And while offering them psychosocial support, what we have noticed as mental health practitioners is that groups that are returnees have this huge disappointment in them. So, like they talk of ISIS in voice of disappointment. What we saw is that those families or people that couldn't go to ISIS lived with that ideology. Our country looks at those as a threat right now. Do you believe that in your respective countries, those people are a bigger threat or the returnees? So, thank you.
Also, extremely briefly, Yigal, very short question, and then I'll ask all of you guys to answer the two questions in 1 minute or so.
Which organized the resistance movement of Naqshbandi that you probably know. So they paid to the ISI in order to not to lose their own people. And then you know that they penetrated ISIS. I mean, most of the military commanders, most of the chemical specialists, and even the ideologues came from the Baathis. What is your reaction to it?
Great, thank you, Eli. I guess, Austin, if you want to take the maybe Austin starts with this, and with the one about reintegration.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for your question. It's a really good one, something I'm still thinking through on a daily basis. And right now, I think the short answer is not that one is a threat and one is not, right? Disillusionment, you're describing disillusionment, correct? That there's a disappointment with their experience in the territorial caliphate, and they're disillusioned from that, from re-participating, right? But I think what's really, really important for the reintegrated persons is there's still the risk of sort of recommitment, re-radicalization if they're not given a credible off-ramp, right? And so if they continue to feel isolated, even in a state of disillusionment, there's still a credible risk that they return, right? And so there really is quite a bit of impetus placed on the success of those psychosocial programs. And so I guess I hesitate to say that the risk is fully resolved, even given their current psychological state. Clearly, for the person who still maybe romanticizes the vision of the caliphate but never actually experienced it, I would say that if those beliefs, those attitudes are still positively inclined towards that kind of behavior, then I would assess that risk is also moderate to high. Yeah.
Do you want to say something, and then?
Yeah.
Sorry, Aimen, let Ido for a second, and then you close, and then we're finished.
I just wanted to quickly add on to Aimen's other comments about the hijras, as I would say eschatology, which you emphasized a lot. ISIS emphasized that much more than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was kind of moving themselves away from that issue, saying the apocalypse is in the future. And part of the reason why I called my book Soldiers of End Times is because ISIS constantly emphasized this, that they will be the army of the apocalypse. They will be the ones to lead the forces of good against the forces of evil, supposedly. And for some reason, like you said, eschatology is like this opium for the masses. It's something that people are really attracted to. And so that's another reason why the hijra to ISIS was much bigger than Al-Qaeda's.
Aimen, you want to close? We close with you.
Yeah, the question that came regarding the money from Ibrahim Izzat Duri, you mean, the vice president. So, around April 9, of 2003, there was a big van driven by Qusay Saddam Hussein, and next to him was Ibrahim Izzat Duri. It went straight into the central bank, and they got at least $660 million out of there, and then they driven with it. And at some point, late April or early May, Zarqawi got his hand on 340 million of that, and it was reported that it was by force. It wasn't just only basically by design that Duri would just give that money to him, but it was actually by force. That he was able to intercept them and to get $340 million of that. And that was the seed capital. Actually, that money, exchanging hands around May of 2003, had a significant impact on the future of Afghanistan. And why? Because Zarqawi, who always had a fondness of both of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, in 2004 he gave 25 million to Al-Qaeda, and in 2005 he gave 25 million to the Taliban. And it is around 2004, 2005 you see the uptick of the Taliban resurgence in Afghanistan. That was the seed capital, which enabled them then to start the process of returning back to imposing the taxation on the farmers and the herders and the traders and the money exchange people. So the seed capital is always important. And that seed capital not only doomed Iraq, it doomed Afghanistan too.
Perfect. Aimen, thank you very much. And I want to thank you all for being here today. This is a very, very interesting conversation. Could have gone on for hours. On behalf of the Program on Extremism and of IDC, I want to thank you all. You already thanked the panelists. So lunch for everybody. But thanks again.